So welcome, y'all. First, we just want to say that our work stands in solidarity with the movements for Palestinian liberation, immigrant justice, and indigenous sovereignty. We believe that none of us are free until all of us are free. Relatedly, happy Pride. We love to have you all here. And I think with that too, I know that it's weighing on us heavily today, but like an acknowledgement that the volume of the wrong that the US did yesterday, the proof of the fact that we were currently living in military coup just becomes greater and greater and present for many of us in many different ways. We just want to hold that and acknowledge it as part of what is living in the room and living in the world with us in this moment, whether it actively makes its way into our conversation or not. We just want to be real about what's actually happening in our world. And then we're all walking around the other day. Sometimes things are just a little bit harder to get by and do the things that we would much rather be doing with our lives. So there's a horrible. So yeah, thank you all for being here with us and being in the community with us in this moment when the world just sets part of the most of us for the life. So just begin over the together. So my name is Daniel Park. You can use the incoming pronouns for me today. Maybe just quick names pronouns for the three also.
Sure. I'm Ari, and I use they and them pronouns.
I'm Matthew, and I use they them pronouns.
I'm Dain, and I use he and they pronouns.
So myself and Ari are two of the worker owners with obvious agency. We are in Philadelphia, dedicated to the creation of a more engaging, democratic, and liberatory cultural ecosystem. That means so many different things. Part of what we do is we produce participatory live performances. We have one happening right now called Space Opera that we'll talk about a decent amount during our panel today that I know Dain spoke about earlier as well in the keynote that they gave. But we create a bunch of different types of performances. We also work with cultural institutions to help them introduce more democratic practices into their creative teams, into their workplaces, things like that. We're very pro-democratic practice, sometimes pro-anarchistic practice in our work and how we want to see culture created in the US. I think we want to start actually just with a little bit of a video to introduce you all to Space Opera and what that project is about.
Every game of Space Opera is a different story, but all stories point back to Earth, to the cataclysms that we face. Space Opera asks us to remember the power of collaboration, creativity, and joy in the face of change. Daisha Harris, first-time audience member.
It's really hard for people to talk about and think about climate change and all of these big changes that we're facing. They shut down, and there was something about talking about it, talking about big changes happening in other planets in a faraway made-up solar system that made it feel accessible to explore. And I just think about the big potential there. To help people start to delve into some of these bigger issues in a way that feels safer and more approachable.
Space Opera moves through a cycle of gameplay phases. In each one, players take actions, make decisions, and roll dice in order to move the story forward. Intro: Society Creation. Players decide who their societies are. Sarah Borbor, first-time audience member.
I think one of the most interesting things was talking to this group who I'd never met before about if we're creating a society, what kind of society would we create? And that's what a lot of the first session was, this world building.
1. Societal phase. Representing communities within their society, players discuss and decide on a major action they will take. Performer facilitator Joseph Ahmed guides one group on what they will contribute to an Olympics-like event called the Gravity Games during their first turn.
It sounds like we have a strong proposal for musical communication in some way being the thing that we take. Voice of the leaders. What are our votes for or against?
I feel like I'm still sticking with musical communication.
So we have one eye. Yeah, how are the people feeling about this?
Oh, furious.
Absolutely furious. This is a core part of who we are, being willy-nilly risked.
2. Galactic Phase. A player from each society presents their actions, rolls dice, and works with game masters Daniel Park and Dain Saint to tell the story of how they succeed or fail.
This game is not D&D, it's a little bit different than that, but we still are using dice in order to represent the randomness of the world.
SG Wood, second time returning player.
The Vidalians would like to use our knowledge of musical communication to charm and delight the audiences of the Galaxies.
Okay, is this the halftime show? Is that what's happening? Who is performing? I need to know who is it? Who did we decide for this year?
Let's see, what is their name? Vida. I mean, that's how well known she is. She only needs one name.
3. Universe Responds. Game masters and performers narrate and theatricalize events happening across the solar system.
So in the start of the second session, the performers came out and acted out something that we as a group had created together, this concert idea. And I think that was a moment where everyone in the whole room just felt like, wow, this was something that we sort of jokingly maybe created or were having fun with. And now this story that we made is being acted out by people or maybe taken seriously, and we should all take it seriously.
The story continues. As phases cycle, societies struggle against an oncoming cataclysm, succeeding, failing, and navigating the consequences. Dain Saint, fourth-time audience member.
We decide to use our power of musical communication or spiritual communication through music to try and talk to the planet, because it's a source of guidance and it's something's off with it. And in doing so, we actually lost all of our musicians, all of our soothsayers. It was miraculous to go from a game to play a game where we got to make a society that truly had no limits on what it could be. And we were kind of laughing as we made these things about, like, we don't know where this is going to lead, and then it led to this really poignant shared moment of loss. And that, I'm still thinking about that weeks later, because I got to just share this with some people who I had only met a couple of hours ago. So I'm really grateful.
It's a 3-day experience, 3 episodes pulling from, major space operas like Star Wars, Dune, et cetera, et cetera. Massive tabletop role-playing game for 40 to 60-ish people at a time, where the story is then theatricalized by professional performers, facilitators, game masters, and designers. Anything else that y'all want to add just in context about space opera or in describing what it is that feels like maybe that's missing from any of this, or does that feel like good enough starting point to y'all? Heard. Okay, cool. Great. Love that. We're doing a great job then. The other thing that I'll say is we're not going to do a panel. We don't have a lot of time, and we want this to be as interesting as possible. So I encourage y'all to look up folks' bios on the NarraScope website, but we're kind of just going to dive into it. So starting question for y'all. Many of us in our various forms and mediums are used to working collaboratively, but space opera as a workplace process has actually been very formally democratic in how we've been working together and collaborating at a bunch of different levels. So I'm curious for you all as artists, as storytellers, and as workers, what are the differences that you experience in working and creating narratives together through a formally democratic process?
Go for it. Okay. So yeah, I've been working in games and creating these sort of experiences for a long time, about 10, 15 years. And I think in my sort of 3 major sections of how I've worked, my first was working in partnership with another artist. That partnership was very like teen parents situation, where we both really cared about the thing that we made, but we hadn't maybe solved our own like emotional difficulties, and that was a lot of conflict in that. And a lot of decisions got made by just like who was the loudest voice in the room. And then when I was working as a journalist, it was very rigidly hierarchical. So even if a journalist had a certain idea, but the editor didn't approve of it, that would kill it, or the editor-in-chief didn't approve of it. And if you kind of spilled out into these other areas, you would get this like, well, that's not your job, but it'd be like angry eyebrows, that's not your job. And one of the things I've really found in this democratic experience in creating space opera is like the kind of the first time that I've had a team member be like, hey, that's not your job, but not like angry eyebrows, but like, hey, you don't have to hold that. There's other people here to hold that with you, and you can kind of like relax. And I found that like this like sort of democratic process and not having the rigid hierarchies and having everybody able to step out into these places and able to step out into these sort of circles was really kind of eye-opening for me and really changed the way that I thought about creating with others.
I can pick up on the "that's not your job" piece in particular. I spend a lot of time working with social justice organizations where people want to work and want to help each other out. And there are these moments where folks just get tired. I remember I was just around the corner working with a group a couple months ago, and somebody was like, this is important that this happens, but I am the least paid person here. Is this my, and we were like, oh, it's not your job. And to help their team be able to articulate that with clarity is really important. And one thing I've appreciated about space opera is roles feel really clear. And so there are different circles is the model that we've been using. There is a theatrical circle, for instance, that has performers and designers in it, but then sometimes we go separately. And sometimes we're going to work with the hospitality and care team, for instance, and overlap in another way. Or sometimes we'll work with the game designers. Like I was part of a circle called the Theatricalization of the Rules Circle. It's a long name, and it was never, but the goal was clear in the name. And so I got to be alongside many of our designers and get clear about, oh, what are the choices we're making? How are you thinking about it? How am I thinking about it? And then realize I don't have to make the final call on that light design decision. That's somebody else's job. But I'm getting to collaborate and just was practice saying, what is my role and when am I just giving feedback? When am I trying to make a decision? And when do I just get to let something go? And I think the clarity of those circles feels really important because I find a lot of times folks try to do something democratically, but it's just chaos of people talking around in circles over and over and over again and nobody making a decision and the meetings being long and everyone being exhausted. The specificity I found really helped. Yeah.
Yeah. I think as a game designer, designing a game in a consensus-based collaborative model was a really interesting challenge, very different from a lot of other artistic experiences that I've had, even though like Obvious Agency, when we work together, we tend to work pretty collaboratively and non-hierarchically. Having a formal consensus process for decision-making was really interesting. And as a game designer, I felt like it led to more drafts of the rules, more eyes on creative decisions, a little bit more flexibility and ability to adapt when people needed to take a step back for whatever reason, because people were more informed at more levels of the process. So it was kind of like, this is a 4+ year game design project, and there are various moments, seasons in life where you have to take a step back, and because we had a consensus process, people could jump in pretty readily because they had to be in order to be decision makers. So that was really interesting. One of the other things that I felt was fascinating was moments where the formal consensus process led to choosing hierarchy. And oftentimes that was in situations where we realized that decisions needed to be made really timely, and that not everyone in the room had capacity to be informed. So in some ways, like, the collaboration allowed us to consent to structures of power that served us in particular moments, and in particular ways that the like questions around player safety and what happens in the room, like if someone if something happens, like our first performance was on the 14th, which was you just lived it. It was last weekend, right? And so we needed to have a safety plan. And we also had chosen a kind of hierarchical structure to make sure that we could make decisions quickly and with the right people. So that was kind of interesting.
Maybe as a follow-up, I'm curious to hear from the three of y'all, like, as like a as a political action, right? To choose to work formally democratically as a group of artists making things, right? Like I hold a bias of, I really believe that how something is made and the end product that is made are intrinsically linked together and inform one another, right? I had this really amazing artist, Ariel Julia Brown, another Philadelphia-based artist, asked me this question of like, can we get free if we are using oppressive tools in order to make liberatory art, right? And so I'm curious for you all, what do you see as like the worth, the advantage, the benefit of like working democratically as a political action versus what do you feel like are the limitations of that potentially? Like what does that do for us and allow for versus what does it hold us back? Thinking specifically like at the scale that most of us here are working on, like as artists, as creators, as academics, as students, et cetera.
I'd say in terms of scale, democratic practice that is not avoiding power is important. I think a lot of times people use democratic process as a shield to actually feel their own sense of power because power is abused around us all the time. And so the choice to say, I'm doing this out of help, I'm doing this for clarity, is really important. And I love that space opera asks people to be in relationship with it. For instance, there's a rule where different societies start off with different numbers of leaders who can vote, and not everyone can vote at the table. And they can change that over time, but if they do, it affects things. Like I can speak to like a group of players I've had before where they have voted everyone into being a leader. Everyone can make a choice. They almost made no choices that time. It took one person who jumped in and was like, we have 2 minutes. We have to choose something right now. And she became louder than she had ever been before. She was like, I've been here before. I know what happens if we don't take an action. So we're gonna do something right now. And that wasn't her abdicating her power in that moment. That was her leaning into saying, we have to do something. That means I have to show up with my wisdom.
Yeah, and I think sort of piggybacking on that, just to sort of answer the question of like what is lost. Speed. Speed is the thing that is generally lost. And when we live in a culture that values speed, where you're like, oh, you got to be first to market. Oh, if you don't do this, somebody's gonna get on that idea. There's a real internal tension as somebody that is being creative of like, we don't have time to take our time. And I think that like these processes can be very difficult because they force us to confront the narrative of the environment in which we create things. The environment in which like, if we don't get this out next week, we're gonna lose funding. If we don't have enough people show up to this thing, we can't eat. And those are the places where like a lot of times people will sort of step away, say, oh, my beliefs have become impractical and I have to capitulate to the system that I am trying to change in order to survive it. And that is the place where we really want to have the time to actually sit with that feeling of discomfort and interrogate those assumptions about what happens if we slow down. And that's one of the things that I found really beneficial about this process is that like it forced me to slow down, especially coming from, an earlier partnership where it's just me and another person and whoever's loudest wins. We made 10 games in 10 years. That wasn't any more sustainable than making this one game for the last 3 years. And really being able to sit with that was really important. And this idea of like giving space for people to find their power in the way that their power shows up, that doesn't always look like being the loudest in the room or being the oldest, having the most experience. This creates ways for perspectives and solutions that you wouldn't otherwise consider simply because the hierarchy of power and decision making would never allow that voice to come to the table.
I'm curious, and so maybe just to paint a clearer picture for y'all. So a critical part of space opera, as hopefully the video started to demonstrate, is one of the main parts of the gameplay loop is players work in groups of about 8-ish people, where they each individually represent a community that is part of the larger society that is that group of 8. Some of those players are voice of the leaders who have a formal vote in the action that that society will take that round, and some are just voice of the people where they can participate in discussion, but they don't actually hold the levers of power in the narrative. So they don't get to vote on, okay, do we do this thing or not, right? So think of like sharing your D&D character with like 3 to 8 other people or whatever, and you kind of start to get the idea of like the chaos that can potentially ensue. I'm curious, right, like turning the lens of this idea of working democratically and what can be gained and lost in sharing power with other folks. Like with everything that you all just shared, Matthew, maybe we'll start with you. How are you finding just random people who are coming to play our game with us? How did they show up for this idea of democratic process? Like, what is that looking like? What are you noticing about like how these people are acculturated to this idea of power sharing and making decisions together?
That's right. I can do it. Thank you. Thanks for the framing too, because right now I'm the only one who's facilitating a table, though folks have done it at other times. So I'm even thinking about the differences in the last 2 weeks. Like last week, I had a table that started with 1 leader. And people weren't happy at first, but they were like, okay, let's just go along with this. Then they had the ability to change it. They were like, nah, there's no need. This is working. And then when they did change it, the first thing the new leader said who got elected was, oh, I'm good. We don't need to elect any more people of power. It was just a joke, a throwaway comment, but it lives in us. And it was so helpful to get it named in the room rather than have it live on the side. And they chose to have no more leaders after that. And it worked really well for them. This past week, they changed and had all sorts of leaders come in. And they were like, let's have even more and more and more. And I, as a facilitator, tried to slow them down. I slowed them down a little bit, but then they changed all of it. But they were then clearer about the choices they made. And they made a very bigger swing choice in the game and in the story, which actually was exciting to see. But the ways they used that power was so different. Some of them were loud. I remember one voice of the leader the whole time was his community was the impatient elders. And so he would just sit back. And the whole people would just keep talking. And somebody would be like, well, what do you think? And he'd say, well, I think we really need to value being honest. It's very important for us. This is our value. And he would just insist in this older, like, I have my way. This is the way. And people were like, well, that threw everything off. But then they got to be in tension with each other in a way that was so playful. So the character helps us actually lean in a little bit more, I find.
I know, so the Dain, Ari, and I were all part of the game design team on the project. And one of the problems that we were dealing with again and again and again is what we were calling the dinkus problem. I know you spoke on this a little bit this morning, but I'm wondering if either of you wants to speak a little bit more towards this dinkus problem that we were trying to solve for.
Keep going on it.
I could. You want to say something?
Oh, yeah, why don't you go?
Okay.
That's a dinkus problem.
Okay, I guess for those of you who maybe didn't catch Dain's talk this morning, we're like, what's a dinkus? It's a made-up word, but one of the continuing problems that we had in this piece was that people actually wouldn't advocate for their communities. They would avoid conflict at the table at all costs and come to like a soft consensus. So they would kind of listen to each other and make a lukewarm gesture with each round. And what that led to was kind of like abdicating the like role play relationship that they might have to their community or the resources that they steward. We had a really hard time getting people to fight, basically. And yeah, I feel like your conversation this morning sort of maybe, do you want to rehash that?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's heartening about this dinkus problem is that it kind of like illustrates for me that people really do want to tell stories together, and are seeking a way to do that. And it's actually very difficult to get people to come into conflict with each other when we tell them that they're meant to do something together. That's something I find really heartening, especially in the current moment when there is so much division. But at the same time, it can be really interesting to see how far the desire to get along can push us towards upholding the status quo because we don't want to have conflict and we don't want to rock the boat. And those two urges of I want to get along and also I don't want to cause problems are at once for me like an amazing thing about people, but also an incredibly like exploitable thing about people. We can and will get used to any system so long as we're told what the parameters of that system are and what our place in it is. And it can be very difficult to break out of that. And I think that some of the stuff that you're talking about happening at your table is really interesting to see the ways that people are starting to come to that realization, especially after coming to like multiple gameplay sessions, where they remember how they showed up or didn't show up last session and start making different choices. Like this session, I'm going to play this differently. And that's the thing I'm really excited about.
So building on this, right, y'all keep it back, it's like, so obviously we see it in the big part of our aesthetic when we're making work is we don't need to get very over interactive. I mean, at least that's the language. If we can do a full run of a performance without an audience there, right, in the way that you would do a traditional play, that is not an obvious agency piece, right? Like, and I think that extends to something like the idea of a choose your own adventure style, right? Well, really the only input that we're getting from the audience is do we take path A or do we take path B? And obviously there's a branch, but what happens down those paths is fully set. We are really invested in this idea of we can only reverse like maybe 40 to 60% of the work before we have an audience because of how critical their input is to shaping the actual experience the day of. We really think of ourselves as systems designers in our work as opposed to more like traditional theater makers in a lot of ways. But so with that context, what I'm curious about is like, for all three of y'all, coming from the backgrounds that you come from, right? As like teachers, journalists, organizers, as artists, creatives, whatever, right? Like, what do you think motivates people towards, like Dain, you framed it as like conflict avoidance in service of the status quo? What do you like, right? We're dealing with a fascist state that wants us to be as passive as possible. Part of what that requires from us, if we don't want to fall into that, is active resistance in a bunch of different ways that can manifest and look like many different things. So I'm interested in, as you're working in this way, as you're